Hola, bienvenidos a Diálogos, soy Facundo Guadagno. Hoy nos encontramos con David Garland. David Garland es básicamente una figura indispensable en la criminología y también en la sociología del estado de bienestar. Sus libros en América Latina pueden conseguirse por la editorial Siglo XXI, pero no obstante, se podría decir que es, además de el editor de la revista Punishment and Society, autor de muchos libros y artículos que son seminales para comprender la criminología y la sociología moderna. En consecuencia, para mí es más que un honor tenerlo a David acá. Ya ha participado Costa Spring Anderson y al mismo tiempo Quentin Skinner. Diálogos se está ampliando a un público básicamente de habla inglesa, así que es realmente un honor tenerlo a David aquí. Dicho eso, hello David, how are you?
Thank you. I'm very well indeed. Nice to be here.
Okay, so basically, I'm starting from actually from your last works. That is a very brief introduction or an introduction to the welfare state, and what uh, what came to my mind is that you said two things that basically welfare state never faded, never disappeared. It has only different shapes. So I'm starting from the last part of it, and at the beginning, how we can trace welfare state. Where is this? Is in the poor laws of United Kingdom, or is it in Machiavelli? Where is it? Where are the roots for the welfare state?
It's a good question. The mode of governance that has emerged and is now like a fundamental dimension of modern capitalist societies, especially modern capitalist democratic societies. But something that performs a similar kind of function, in other words, that attends to the welfare of the poor or the needy or the sick, has been in existence ever since human social groups have been organized, right? So the notion that there was protector states, that there was a concern to feed the poor, that there were national poor laws developed in the early 17th century in England, or that churches always attended to the sick and the infirm. That's a feature of all organized social life. Were it not that we society would be kind of suicide clubs. Basically, the need for human beings to attend to the weak and the poor is kind of is a given, not out of altruism or out of compassion necessarily, but mostly people are connected with each other, and the idea that we have some um, reciprocal needs and reciprocal obligations is part of that. The welfare state I think of as being a distinctively modern version of that universal undertaking, and one that really emerges together with industrial society and particularly with modern market capitalism. So welfare states, yes, a universal function, but actually a specific historically defined period and mode of performing that function.
What you were saying here is that if there is like a need, I perceive it like a functionalist approach, like there is a social need for that, or what is like your theoretical framework for doing that approach?
So a functional argument or functional analysis is only ever one part of a sociological explanation or a political explanation, right? So what one can operate at the level of systems and system needs. For example, it seems to me that's clear that capitalism as a system of economic action um, is so dynamically creatively destructive, is so prone to develop in ways which consumes and undermines the social and human conditions upon which it depends for its existence, that functionally there is a requirement for a kind of counter system, a compensating system, a moral economy, if you like, that constrains and enables capitalism to persist. That's a functional argument. Um, In the same way, you might say that the development of industrial society and the collapse of the traditions and the customs and the arrangements of agrarian societies functionally required some new apparatus or institutions. However, that's a limited form of explanation. It requires the supplementary provision of a historical explanation where one discusses the actual dynamics, social actors, events, developments that put in place the apparatus which could, to some extent, approximate to or perform that function. Now, there's no guarantee that functional needs of any system will be met. Social arrangements have collapsed. Societies and nation states have collapsed, have been transformed, have been overthrown because their functional needs weren't met. So there's nothing guaranteed about a functional analysis and the identification of functional needs. However, it does seem to me to be an insightful remark to say that there's something intrinsic to a capitalist mode of production, for example, that requires for its functional maintenance the operation of forms of social insurance, social provision, market regulation that we call welfare states.
Yeah, and that is actually basically like a paraphrasing Marshall in social class and citizenship and social class. He is saying that he will not. His intention is not to destroy capitalism, but to reduce income inequality. So, in this sense, what I wanted to ask is that are you doing like an explanation from institutions? I'm following Hall here, the political scientist. For example, are you following institutions by interest, by power, or a Marxist explanation? How are you approaching this capitalist needs, this vital needs in the capitalist system?
So there are many aspects of capitalist economic systems and their characteristic dynamics and their characteristic pathologies that Marx identifies very accurately and in a way that continues to be valid and important today. There are many other aspects of capitalism that Marx's analysis fails to identify or stops short of presenting, and there are many features of the Marxist analysis that turn out to be limited to the 19th century context in which he was writing. So sure that there are power interests, sure there are social actors that are organized according to class. Certainly it's the case that the dynamics of capitalist development are generative of exploitations and inequalities and forms of social consequence which are catastrophic for human life much of the time. But the key feature about capitalism as it's developed in the 19th and into the 20th century and today is that alongside this form of economic life have developed legal and social and political institutional arrangements which have modified, moderated, blunted the impact of capitalist systems. But one of the things that I should say right at the start is that to talk about capitalism is to talk about an ideotypical economic system whereby production is undertaken for sale in a market as commodities, that resources like labor and capital and land are obtained through the market and for the market, private property and the means of production, wage labor, and so on. These characteristics of capitalism define a system of economic action and contrast it, say, to state socialism or to feudalism. But capitalism only ever exists within institutional contexts that are defined by legal and political and often religious and moral arrangements. In other words, there's no such thing as capitalism, only capitalism grounded in social and legal arrangements. And that combination of economic forms that are capitalist and political and social arrangements which are providing the political economy in which capitalism subsists. That's the key to understanding here. And what I would really argue is that since Marx was writing, and really Marx was writing as a Marxist from the 1840s through to the 1860s, 1880s, that's precisely at the moment when the human pathologies of capitalism, and particularly of liberal capitalism, market fundamentalism, and capitalism, are beginning to be understood and countered by a social state, by social arrangements which provide respite from capitalism, which modify the juggernaut of capitalism, which put in place arrangements to secure people from the consequences of exploitation and capital. So there's a great deal to be said about political economy and capitalist societies, which Marx doesn't tell us about, which actually but post-date the Marxist analysis, which have to supplement and extend Marxist analyses.
And in this sense, you are basically in the opposite side of basically liberalism that, well, in the sense that if we follow the Scottish tradition or even the Austrian tradition, is treating basically the market as natural, as given. So you are saying that market is created basically following in the substantivist tradition by Karl Polanyi. Am I right?
So Karl Polanyi is exactly correct in asserting and insisting that market arrangements, free market capitalist arrangements, barter, trade, and exchange on a capitalist basis are not naturally occurring. That they aren't the kind of the natural state of affairs that are then subsequently overlaid by legal regulations or restrictions. On the contrary, markets are the creations of particularly legal and political actors who put in place forms of exchange, forms of currency, rules of sale and contract, protections for fair exchanges that ensure against force and fraud and so on. In other words, markets are always already regulated, always already the product of legal orders, at a minimum, products of custom and tradition and expectation and social norms, but today always the outcome of legal regimes. So any thought that there was once a kind of state of nature and it was a market is an absurdity, which is why when we began and we talked about how welfare state in some sense is a universal, what I wanted to say was that market society was a kind of utopian project of 19th century England, which, to the extent free labor and free land and free exchange and wages were actually implemented and free trade were implemented, it was at a huge human cost, particularly to workers, particularly to the old, particularly to people who are unemployed, particularly to people who were living in industrial conditions where there was very little in the way of social support. And these social costs were quickly identified and militated against by all sorts of social actors. This is Polanyi's point, that the project of a utopian liberal market economy is precisely that, a utopian one, which ends up with dystopian consequences for people who aren't advantaged by property distribution. So for that reason, one begins to see the emergence of social arrangements that restrain and modify and interfere with market forces in ways designed to rebalance the economy away from ultra-liberal market fundamentalism towards something more stable, more secure, more compatible with democracy, and more compatible with human life.
I totally agree. And in 2004, Adam Saworski asked if there was actually a main cause, and if there was a reason to ask for a main cause or for a primary cause. And he compared institutionalism with Marxism in the sense that they provide a theological um, causal relation. So, in that sense, in that article, Saworski ends up saying there are no primary causes, and um, we have to look for the endogenous causes. Therefore, and this is the question: who created the market? Because if we follow Hayek, we can say, in all the liberal tradition, that this is by the spontaneous order of human beings that are not aware of what they are doing. But here, if we follow Polanyi or Eric Wolf or other people, we are saying no. Here are institutions, but institutions are made by people, by individuals. So, who created the market in the end?
So there is no one market, and the question of who created a particular market will be a historically specific, localized one, depending on the kind of market and the place you're talking about. So the market is a very interesting term, right? So there are markets on Saturdays and Wednesdays in a local square here, close to here, where farmers come and sell their products. That's a market. Um, there's a market if I put something on eBay and someone's interested in purchasing whatever it is that I'm selling, I create a market for it. But when we say market, we typically are using like an abstraction that describes a crucial element of a capitalist system of economic production and exchange, right? The idea of the market as um, a description of the ideal order in which goods are exchanged or for which goods commodities are produced and which set the price for everything. That notion of a market is really an emergent feature of um, modern economic life that really comes into being with the physiocrats and with political economy in the 17th and 18th centuries as an abstraction of economic thought. Um, if the question is, and so you can, as it were, uh, specify the provenance and the development of that concept by tracing its development in the history of ideas, looking at particular conceptions of the wealth of nations, particular conceptions of exchange or of the economy of nature, and so on. Um, if one is asking a different question, namely, who is it that creates, for example, the market as it operates today in you know contemporary America, then the answer is it's constantly being remade. Some of its elements are fundamental and date from the beginning of the American empire, the American colonies, when property distributions of the primary kind are established, typically by force and fraud and invasion and uh, colonization.
Eric Wolf says in Europe and the people on the know people without history. I know the term in Spanish. Europa y los pueblos sin historia.
Right.
Uh,
So there's elements of the market which we assume are kind of beyond question, which are simply beyond question because the power of property owners um, is such that they defend their property and the conception of property so powerfully that it doesn't come up for discussion. Um, Other elements, for example, a minimum wage as part of a contract, as part of a market, or the development of trade restrictions or rules about who has license to sell what, or or what is permissible to be sold. These are rules that are on the margins being made and remade every electoral cycle, sometimes every election. Um, So the markets are being made and remade. Sometimes elements of them are stable over lengthy periods of time. Sometimes on the margins, they are up for reconsideration and development. Is this a free trade, globalizing neoliberal society? Is it a restrictive mercantilist one where trade restrictions are being put in place and free trade is being ended in favor of American first policies? It depends. Do we, are we thinking about the Trump administration or the Biden administration? So the notion of who creates a market is either a question about a specific market, in which case the answer is the political actors, the economic actors who've been actively producing their conditions of exchange in recent times, or it's a question about an abstraction, namely the market, such as Hayek, for example, is theorizing, or in an earlier life, Adam Smith is theorizing in very different kinds of ways.
And in other aspect, you discuss, I guess if my reading is correct, the idea of let's say mainstream idea of well, the welfare state ended because of the negative trade-off between inflation and salaries, and because the OPEC cartel. Uh, well, it is true that some form of the welfare state ended, but it never disappeared. So, and I wanted to analyze a particular case. Is the new laborism, the Blair and Brown administration, uh, part of the welfare state?
Yes, of course. So it's useful, I think, to pause for a moment and kind of suggest some definitional ground rules for discussing this, right? So it seems to me the case that at least since the late 19th, early 20th century, Britain, to take that example you're talking about with New Labour, but most other developed countries have been developing welfare states. That by the middle of the 20th century, most Western nations, particularly most of the developed industrialized capitalist nations, had indeed established the core institutions of welfare states. It also seems to me that these core institutions still exist today, that the welfare state continues to be a fundamental dimension of modern government in capitalist societies, particularly capitalist democratic societies. But in other societies too, but let's just talk about that rather large set to begin with. It's also the case, however, that welfare states, their institutions, their programs, their calibration, um, are constantly being transformed. They're either being tweaked and extended or upgraded or adapted, or they're being sometimes quite fundamentally transformed, so that the welfare state that existed really from the 1940s to the 1970s isn't the kind of welfare state precisely that exists at the end of the 20th century. I would describe one as being the classic welfare state, the post-war welfare state, and the second being the neoliberal welfare state, one that has been neoliberalized in all sorts of ways. So, and one can say the welfare state persists, but of course it persists in changed form. Sometimes its core institutions like Social Security, national insurance, healthcare provision continue and indeed become more extended or more widely available, or even in the case of Social Security and pensions, more generous over that period of time. But other elements, for example, means tested benefits for dependent children, for single mothers, provision for the unemployed, they often are transformed in quite serious ways, quite extensive ways, so that elements of the welfare state persist over time, other elements are modified or transformed or added to. So there's constancy at the larger level and change in detail. You asked about New Labour. New Labour, rather like New Democrats and Bill Clinton in the USA, where I am, embraced to a degree many of the policies and programmatic projects that we've come to call neoliberal. That's to say that they began to embrace ideas that somehow or other government had become sclerotic or slow or inefficient, and that probably market mechanisms could be made to could be extended, and that somehow or other economic growth and even the provision of welfare services like education um, or housing could be improved through market mechanisms. In other words, the New Labour government of the 1990s, Tony Blair's government, then briefly Gordon Brown's, I think did embrace some of the key elements that we think of as being neoliberal. For example, building public-private partnerships. For example, introducing market mechanisms into otherwise public institutions, imposing performance indicators on the production of public goods, seeing that the possibility of privatizing the delivery of welfare benefits. All of these things were undertaken by New Labour at the same time that the governments of Blair and Brown wanted to massively increase expenditure on education, massively increase expenditure on the healthcare system, and massively increase expenditure to ensure child poverty was reduced. So, what is that kind of politics? It's not easy to summarize in a slogan like neoliberal. Or social democratic. It's some combination of these two things, depending on how which policies you're describing and what level of specificity you're getting at. Um, the it's clear that the governments that succeeded, the conservative governments or conservative liberal governments that succeeded after New Labour, were committed to much more austere policies, were much less concerned about the prevention of poverty, were much less concerned about the improvement of healthcare and education. So, to call both of these neoliberal is a mistake, or fails to capture really very important differences that matter in terms of people's employment prospects, educational prospects, uh, levels of poverty and health. But nevertheless, there's some features in common that we often bundle together when we're looking at these things from a great distance and comparing them with, for example, social democracy or with socialism.
When you're saying social democracy, you're referring to the Nordic cases, or
So social democracy, so the Norwegian, Swedish, Danish, Finnish nations and economies are indeed more social democratic than, for example, the USA or Britain today by quite a long way. When one says social democracy, what I think that means is a commitment to a mixed economy in which labor unions are empowered, in which working people are secured, in which capitalism is permitted and indeed embraced, but is made to be aligned with democratic and indeed social values. So that social democracy is, to me, a form of socialized capitalism. The means of production remain, for the most part, in private hands. Commodities are produced, for the most part, for sale in the market. But in important areas of life, there's an act of decommodification. That's to say that vital goods, for example, healthcare, education, to an extent housing, are provided, childcare, are provided outside of the market, and are guaranteed. And these are the features: mixed economy, social provision, guaranteed universal benefits, empowered labor unions. These are the features of social democracy. And at various points in time, they have been the characteristics of British governments. For example, that the Attlee government in 1945, 1951 was committed to building socialism, to building a socialist commonwealth, but actually it governed in a social democratic style. It nationalized some industries. Um, it had a project for developing social control of the commanding heights of the economy, but in fact, what it delivered was properly described. It would be properly described as social democratic. Um, it didn't disturb the foundations of capital. What it did was modify their operation in ways that secured working people and in ways which made certain goods, for example, healthcare, and at that time, education all the way through to university education, free at the point of delivery, the point of service. So I think of that, the Attlee government as being social democratic. I think of the new Labour government as having still elements of social democratic governance as part of their platform, but very heavily modified by commitments to financial deregulation, commitments to market forces, a really diluted form of social democracy.
Yeah, actually, financial deregulation is the first thing that 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 happened that Gordon Brown did. But what I want to ask is, going back to the previous question, is that if what was the reason of the clash of for the classic, let's say, welfare state, the one that you were mentioning about, well, FDR or Attlee, that kind of people, because there is this mainstream thing about the negative trade-off of salaries and inflation and the OPEC cartel, but that is one thesis, and the other is that it's like there is like an explosion in capitalism that has to appear, that has to go, and then we go to a different way of market, like natural forces that are beyond our control.
So one of the commitments, a primary commitment of welfare state governance in the 1930s in the USA, in the 1940s in Britain, and in many other nations across the Western landmass, was full employment. Full employment was viewed as being vital to the persistence of democracy, because in the 1930s, when there had been the collapse of capitalist economies everywhere, where mass unemployment had persisted for a decade at a time, the result was the collapse of democracy. The results of fascism, Nazism, communism. The lesson that was learned by the Allied powers during the Second World War, already in the Atlantic Treaty, in the Atlantic Charter, certainly in the kind of the New Deal and the welfare state as developed by FDR in the USA and by the national government and eventually the Labour government in Britain, there was the clear understanding that if capitalist societies permit masses of people to be unemployed, then the democratic institutions will collapse. Therefore, full employment was deemed to be a kind of a requirement of governing in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. Now, full employment after the war, when there was like reconstruction to be done, when there was a growing world market where some of the nations like Britain, for example, were already advanced, and the USA particularly, were advantaged because they had an industrial plant in place and they could provide and they could export to feed this hungry world market that was developing, or to supply the needs of this hungry world market. They did indeed experience full employment. But the way in which full employment was managed always had the built-in problem, which was if employment is fully deployed, if labor is fully deployed, then the price of labor, which is a market price, will increase. If the price of wages increases, then prices will increase. When prices increase, wage settlements adjust to the inflationary background of prices. And what you get built in is a kind of a spiral whereby every wage settlement is trying to imagine what prices will be like in a year and builds in an inflationary wage settlement. So that kind of dynamic is really problematic for any capitalist economy. The way that that gets managed is corporatist arrangements built up between the social partners, between business, labor, and government, in ways which manage wage settlements, which have incomes and price policies, which manage investment in ways which are planned. Now, the Nordic nations, the social democratic welfare states, did indeed manage inflationary dynamics much more successfully than did the liberal market economies like the USA, like the UK. Why? Because in these nations, in Sweden, for example, trade unions and government and business were capable of cooperating in planning for investment, education, wage settlements, and price agreements. In other words, the dynamics that are built into a Keynesian welfare state, into welfare capitalism, are manageable if, but only if, business and labor are willing and able to cooperate in that management. In the UK, for example, to come back to the example we were talking about, interestingly, I think disastrously, the trade union movement was never interested in corporatist institutions, was always keen on collective bargaining. In other words, the trade union movement, which saw its primary uh, loyalty and its primary goal as being to serve the interests of its individual members rather than the interests of the nation or even the interest of the Labour Party to which it was affiliated, preferred to be a market actor, um, benefiting from market strength when there was full employment and when the labour was needed, and bargaining for better wages and better conditions for their employees. That ensured that when an inflationary dynamic began to feed into the economy, that there was no way of disciplining labor, wages, and prices. So indeed, inflationary dynamics did take off in the UK and did become one of the bases on which the labour movement and the labour governments were defeated in the 1970s. So what I'm describing is indeed one of the problems of a managed economy, one of the problems of a mixed economy, particularly when government is seen to be able to set the price for wages in the public sector, or indeed to intervene in and to manage wage settlements in the private sector. In other words, people constantly turn to government and expect their wages to be managed in a way that will insure them against inflation. That's precisely why someone like Gordon Brown, when he entered government as the Chancellor of the Exchequer, decided that the thing to do to stabilize the economy was to try to take interest rates, and therefore, to some extent, prices, certainly the price of money, out of political control and give it to the Bank of England. The idea being to kind of neutralize or to separate out economic decisions from political decisions, so that the address to which people would send their complaints wouldn't be the government, but would be to their employers or to the market. So these were indeed problems that were a feature of any national economy which was governed through Keynesian demand management in the 1950s, 60s, into the 70s. However, one of the other features which we have to bear in mind is that managed national economies, social democratic governance of economic life, presumes that the nation state is the unit that is capable of controlling economic activity, economic flows, economic life in that jurisdiction. That was true under the Bretton Woods Agreement to a degree, that the arrangement for democratic capitalism coming out of the war years was that there should be free trade between nations, but every national economy would have its kind of its area where government was capable of setting the terms of levels of provision, levels of decommodification, levels of wages, minimum wages, levels of insurance, and so on. And that could only be done if the flow of capital was restricted. That could only be done if it were the case that most capital investment was done by national capital. That's to say, British investment was done by British firms, American investment by American firms, not by a free flow of capital across national boundaries. Because as soon as these capital restrictions are removed, then the capacity of national governments to control their own economies is drastically reduced. In other words, if capital can up and move to somewhere where wages are cheaper, where there's fewer overheads on capital, then there's no reason why they need to invest in a high wage economy when they can invest in a low wage economy. So deregulation and globalization at that level were other elements which undermined the capacities of social democratic governments to maintain welfare states on the classic post-war model.
And moving, well, I know if it's a total move from the welfare state, but recently when I was in the teachers department in my university, we were talking. I was talking to a law teacher, and he said that Foucault was the last of the scholars that actually did something new for the legal theory. I think that it's a bit too much, but if we consider a reader on punishment, mass imprisonment, the culture of control, all of your books are these Foucault core developments. Uh, I would really like to think, how do you imagine the state? How do you see these spaces, the strategies, the resistance that Foucault allowed you to think? Why is Foucault so important for you to conceive the state? And in the end, how do you conceive the state?
So these are a series of interesting questions. And I think that probably Foucault was the last theorist I was turned to theorize the state. But it's true that in the course of the work I've done, much of it, not all of it, much of it has been done in conversation with, a reading of, and an engagement with Foucault's work. The welfare state work I've been doing recently is the least influenced and the least supported by Foucauldian ideas. I think that I myself believe that some of the work that Foucault did on governmentality, on biopolitics, was intended by Foucault to lead to a theorization of what I'm calling welfare states, or mixed economies, or social democratic contemporary political styles of governing. But I don't think that he ever really succeeded in getting there. I think that some of the groundwork in his analyses of concept of police, concept of raison d'etat, concept of neoliberalism, notions of mechanisms of security, notions of governmentality, that they were moving towards putting in place elements for the study of contemporary welfare states, but he didn't ever quite get there. And his argument about how socialists had never developed their own form of governmentality, I think really was a mistake. I think that actually what we're discussing today with regard to welfare state styles of governing is precisely the socialist or the social democratic style of governing that was new in the world in the 20th century, and which really was distinct from prior modes. But anyway, all that to say that Foucault doesn't have a big stamp on the writing about welfare states that I've been doing. In contrast, the work I did in the past on systems of punishment and welfare, the way that the development in the 19th century of criminal justice and forms of criminological thinking and forms of incarceration and supervision of offenders. That work was heavily influenced by Foucault. His book Discipline and Punish was essential to the work I did on the history of punishment and welfare in the UK at the turn of the 20th century. A book I wrote, The Culture of Control, was, I think, applying Foucauldian style ideas to, pardon me, the 1970s through to the 1990s, when many of the styles of criminal justice that Foucault had described in Discipline and Punish began to fall apart, and began to be replaced by elements which seemed, in a Foucauldian way, to be anachronistic. Notions of retributive punishment, for example, notions which blew past medical legal conceptions and reasserted retributive ones. So I was interested in understanding these developments. I also wrote a book about the death penalty, in the USA, called Peculiar Institution.
Yeah, but I didn't want to talk
And,
about
and
that.
that particular book, I found Foucault's ideas about the death penalty, which he developed in Discipline and Punish, to be singularly unhelpful for thinking about the USA, because it was so very different, the conception of the state that operated in absolutist Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries as compared to 19th and 20th century America. That the Foucauldian idea of the death penalty really didn't kind of um, have any traction in the USA, although it was a nice jumping off point of contrast.
Trying to say is that we are not moving actually from the welfare state, because what are we seeing is that well, basically from the culture of control, what you were saying actually, just a couple of seconds of minutes maybe, is that after this welfare state, and I know that this is a complex term, but harmony disappears, then a new state, a new state that is uh, with the aim of punish emerges. So there is a struggle of class, of gender, that were not in the agenda of the 60s, of the 70s, and in the 90s they, well, they like were huge. So like you said, Foucault is like a toolbox here. So, what were the situation that you saw in the 80s or in the 90s or in the end of the 20th century that was different from the 19th century?
Right. So I think that the inflection point I was describing, which really occurred in the 1980s, 1970s, 1980s, in the USA, but also in the UK, interestingly, was one where the welfarist conceptions of criminal justice and criminology and punishment reached their limits, and were regarded by both policymakers and criminal justice actors, and eventually by politicians and the public, as coming to be discredited and no longer effective. What I mean by that is that during the mid 20th century, in the heyday of the social democratic welfare state, or the New Deal and the Great Society in the USA, there was never, never entirely, never completely, but there was a conception amongst progressive policymakers, progressive criminal justice actors, progressive penologists, that social provision, education, improved welfare, social work, uh, psychiatry and psychology, that all of these would eventually lead to the reduction of poverty and the reduction of crime. That one would see somehow or other a welfare state being rewarded with a reduction in social pathology, social deviance, criminality. And that the on the one hand, the development in the economy, in employment, in the improvement in people's conditions of life, in the kind of the growth of a middle class, together with a more rehabilitative or welfareish style of treating young offenders or treating people in rehabilitative prisons and so on, that all of that would lead to reduced crime, improved rehabilitation, reduced recidivism. In the 1960s, 1970s, all of the data about criminal behavior, about levels of criminal involvement, but particularly levels of violent crime, armed robberies and homicides, which in a way are more reliably reported and we have better data about. All of these indicators suggested the reverse was happening. In other words, that instead of finding that the growth of social democratic prosperity, the extension of the welfare state would lead to less crime, it seemed to be coinciding with, if not causing, more crime. And this was pointedly juxtaposed in the 1960s in the USA, when just when Lyndon Barnes Johnson, the president, was introducing the Great Society, the kind of completion of the New Deal with Medicare and Medicaid, and the war on poverty with Head Start and the provision of various forms of government support for inner cities and government support for the left behind African American populations, particularly, that just as these things were being rolled out and the civil rights movement and the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act were being legislated, urban unrest, riots, armed robbery, homicides began an upward spike that continued into the 80s and 90s. So for many people, but especially for conservatives, free marketeers, hard right Republicans, this was proof positive that all of the assumptions about a welfare state will reduce pathology and eventually cure crime had been fundamentally flawed. And that in fact, maybe the welfare state, maybe provision for the poor, maybe rehabilitative treatment, maybe reduced punishment, community service, community measures rather than incarceration, maybe they'd all been perversely making the problems worse rather than making them better. And so there was a kind of recalibration of criminal justice policy, of crime control policy, of policing and punishment all across the spectrum, which emphasized not welfare provision, social support, social work, reform, but rather increased control, increased policing, increased punishment, increased penal control. And that was what I was describing in the book that I published in 2001 that was called The Culture of Control. It was really about the transformation of crime control and criminal justice and policing and punishment at a certain moment, which coincided with the decline of faith in the post-war welfare state and the beginnings of a kind of rightward movement, which led to neoliberalization of welfare state, led to the reduction in support for organized labor, led to deregulation, privatization, what we now call neoliberalism. So that's what that book was mostly about. None of that is very Foucauldian. None of that was really anticipated in Discipline and Punish or any of Foucault's other works. But I did approach the question with certain kind of structuralist ideas in mind. In other words, I tried to look at the field of crime control and criminal justice as a structured field, and to see how its forms of knowledge were being transformed, and to try and ask the question as to why they were being transformed and in what direction. So that's what that book was about. That's how it relates to the welfare state and behind it to Foucault.
Yeah, but Foucault, in that sense, I was thinking about the so-called deviances, because if we go to a book by Philippe Bourgeois that is In Search of Respect, I don't know if you, well, yeah, selling crack in the barrio. What is the and also there's a book in the 60s about the vice lords of Chicago, and what are these people saying? That the welfare state, the idea, and this is in Castell as well, that the notion that you have one job, you have a pension, that you have something for life, that is guaranteed, is lost. So, who are the main? Well, who are the one that are going to suffer this? Um, this disappearance of the welfare state, in some sense. The African American population, the Latinos, like Puerto Ricans, and that is the deviance. That is the different that we have to punish. We do not have to see the causes. We have to punish. That is the Foucaultian thing that I was thinking about.
So I think that as it were is Foucault once or twice removed. But so that there's two different points I want to make. One is that the the critique of the American welfare state as having somehow perversely created more problems, more poverty, more crime, rather than resolve them, that was always absurd, because the American welfare state was never extended, never provided full employment, never provided social support, never ensured and housed and provided healthcare to large sections of the lower class populations, but above all to Black Americans and people of color. So the discrediting of the welfare project that occurred with the New Right and New Republicans in the 1970s, 1980s was based on a profound mischaracterization of the welfare state. This wasn't a problem of theory. This wasn't a theory failure. This was an implementation failure. But there's a different question which I want to talk about a little, which you implied or you referred to just now. And it's a more extensive and important one. Um, the post war welfare state, which was a style of governing which utilized various techniques and institutions, for example, social insurance, um, national insurance in Britain, social security in America, um, was premised upon some fundamental assumptions about the nature of the economy and the nature of the population. It assumed that by and large, um, working people were male, that they were employed in industrial manufacture, that they were unionized, that they were relatively secure in their jobs, that they would be trained apprentices, they would um, be earning a family wage, that they would be over time would receive improved wages, seniority, and during that whole period of time, they were saving for their pension through national insurance schemes, and they were providing for their families with a family wage. The families were assumed to be um, heterosexual normative families with a male breadwinner, a female working at home, and children who were dependents, and that the unionized family wage would provide for them. Um, Social Security, national insurance were designed to uh, contributions from the worker and pay dividends to the worker and his dependents. Um, Both of these assumptions, the assumptions about work and the assumptions about family, became increasingly falsified by historical transformations in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. In other words, the labor market and the nature of work underwent massive transformations in the UK, in the US, and all around the developed world, as first of all, the power of trade unions diminished, as the nature of work was transformed, as the people no longer had secure lifetime tenure work, but instead had, with benefits, instead had more and more precarious work, flexible work, um, wages that didn't cover a family's requirements, women having to work two wage earners in every family because one person could never earn enough if there were children. Um, Increasingly, the character of work was transformed in ways that made the previous welfare state arrangements no longer cohere with the reality of the workplace. Secondly, the nature of the family and the household was transformed. So when the 1930s New Deal and the 1940s welfare states were developed, most of the time, if there were single parents with children, it was because of death, because one of the spouses had died, typically the man, a woman was left with children, and therefore they were dependent. So aid to families with dependent children was all about providing for widows who had kids at home. Um, Over the period of the 1960s and 1970s, for reasons that have partly to do with changes in economic life, but partly to do with women's emancipation, partly to do with democratization, partly to do with cultural factors that are really extensive and important, more and more households did not look like that. More and more households were composed of single parents. More and more houses were formed with people who were married, then separated, married, then divorced, or people who had never been married but had children nonetheless. Um, so suddenly, the arrangements for providing for children who need to be provided for by the state, if parents and the labor market aren't doing so, no longer operated. That more and more people were not widows with children, but were single parents who were whose whose husbands typically were still alive but were no longer living and providing. So the design of the welfare state, the idea originally was you provide aid for families with dependent children to allow women to stay home with their kids. When it came to be in the 1970s, 1980s, that many of these women with their kids were single mothers, the notion of married women that they were going to work, and here were single parents being allowed to stay at home by given taxpayer funded benefits by the state, that was regarded by many conservative women and their spokespeople as being unacceptable. Why should these women get to stay home courtesy of the state and the taxpayer when I have to go to work? So suddenly the notion of welfare reform was to get these women to go to work while their children were dependent on tax benefits. So there was an utter transformation in the conception of the family, the reality of the family, and provision for the family. Similarly, over time, the insurance schemes that welfare was designed to be based on insurance, and in the end, there'd be no need for means testing because everybody would be insured. That turned out to be utterly at odds with the reality of employment by the time the 1970s, 1980s, and deindustrialization and the service industries happened, because more and more people are in temporary employment, more and more people are unemployed from time to time. People who are, for example, female with children are in part-time employment. Um, None of these are well catered for by a national insurance scheme where you contribute every month, every week of every month of every year for 40 years. At the end of it, you get a pension, because many of these women, for example, or temporary workers were in employment that would be part-time, temporary, would not allow their contribution record to be stable over time and eventually to provide them with the benefits of retirement or disability or insurance for unemployment. So the whole welfare state scheme had to be adapted to a new labor market, much more flexible, precarious, temporary, feminized, and a new household, much more heterogeneous, much less two family, single breadwinner. And all of that transformation of the welfare state had to occur through political processes that would, you know, tax people in order to redistribute to these workers and these families. And that, of course, is politically challenging, because the people who are currently catered for by the welfare state aren't interested in paying more tax to provide for the people who are not catered for by the welfare state. So governments have to be willing to be either growing the economy and making sure that everybody is benefiting and their conditions of life are improving, or deciding who will win and who will lose. And that's very difficult for people who depend on votes. And indeed, the major difficulty of welfare states in the 1980s, 1990s, and today has been how to redistribute, how to recalibrate welfare provision at a time when there's not a growing economy. Because the result is that you have to do unpopular things, taxing people more, in order to do necessary things, providing for people who need. Now we see this right now very vividly in the efforts of um, um, Macron's government in France to adjust retirement age in order to take account of the actuarial reality of every developed nation, which is that there are more and more people who are surviving for lengthy periods of time, who therefore are out of the workforce, who therefore are need to be provided with insurance benefits, and fewer people who are in the workforce paying for these benefits. So typically, you either have to make the adjustments for that actuarial reality by taxing people more while they're in work, or allowing people to retire later in order that the benefit population is reduced. And bringing about that political change is massively difficult
This is the same issue in Argentina. The same thing.
everywhere. I mean, but basically, these actuarial features are a characteristic of the 21st century. And there is no way to bring about the adjustment that they require except by imposing costs on some demographic group or other. And if these demographic groups vote, then they'll vote against the proposal.
These are the limits of politics and economics. And well, for the last question that I want to do, because I will be like talking forever with you, is like for peculiar institution, that is your book about death penalty. That this is the thing that I wanted to talk, is that I if we go back again to the welfare state erased phase, let's say, we can see that in popular culture, even in Taxi Driver or in New York, that you receive like a badge that welcome to the most unsafety city of the world, or something like that. Or I don't know if that is an urban myth or something, but there is like, as you said, like this idea that the welfare state failed, therefore we must punish. So how is that? Um, we can see it in rap music, in gangster rap, and in other cultural manifestations. And the answer to this is death penalty. The answer to this is more and more punishment. Um, do you see that because of the creation of the roots of the welfare state as the three models of the welfare state, as you mentioned before? This is the consequence of it.
So I don't remember when Taxi Driver was released, but New York City,
Nin-
between
1976.
the 1970s and the present, New York City has um, experienced a massive improvement in urban safety and a huge decline in homicides. Nevertheless, one of the things that's true about the USA, which Americans don't always appreciate themselves because this is not a nation that looks abroad for comparisons. Um, America, as compared to most developed liberal democracies and most affluent nations, has a remarkably high and extraordinarily high homicide level and level of violent crime. Um, Other forms of crime, property crime, public order crime, aren't especially different from the norm. But as compared to Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Western Europe, homicide rates, violent rates in the USA have always been exceptionally high. Um, that's, I think, a question to that requires explanation. And I actually believe that the political economy of the USA, the labor market and its levels of inequality and insecurity, and the failure of the USA to develop forms of social provision and public goods that relieve poverty and enable families to be and neighborhoods to be supported when there's a lack of work, when there's a lack of economic prosperity. These political economy and welfare state failures are, I think, behind the high levels of violence and social problems that one finds in the USA. Um, it's also the case, I believe, that precisely because the American state at the federal, state, and local levels hasn't developed a large apparatus of social care and social provision and social work, that when social problems do occur, when there is violence, when there is drug addiction, when there is crime on the streets, there are few remedies, few responses available to government. And in the USA, the level of government charged with dealing with public order, public safety is the local government, um, other than policing and punishment. In other words, large scale social investment, large scale economic aid, improving housing and healthcare and education and schools, improving employment. These are not remedies that are either available to or politically popular in government in the USA. So, faced with high levels of violence, high levels of public insecurity, physical insecurity, faced with a political demand that something be done about street crime and armed robberies and homicides and so on, the standard American answer throughout the 1980s and 1990s was policing and punishment. And the build-up of police powers, the build-up of mass stop and search, the build-up of mass incarceration, collateral consequences, controls. Now, um, undoubtedly, these forms of aggressive policing and punishment did have some impact on levels of crime and homicide. So too did changes in drug markets and the character of drug use and so on. So did changes in gang organization and so on. But other developments, for example, the action by community groups, the action by business groups to try to make their neighborhoods safer, to make their streets safer, to make to take care of their property when the police and the criminal justice system weren't doing such a good job. These things combined did indeed lead to reduced levels of homicide and armed robbery and safer streets and safer cities. Um, so I do think that the political economy of the USA led to elevated levels of violence and elevated levels of punishment to deal with that violence. Um, the mechanism is not straightforward. They operate through family formation, through community organization, through informal social controls in the way that they're undermined by the lack of work, the lack of social support, the lack of housing and healthcare, and so on. But I do believe that the characteristics of the American economy and its welfare state are indirectly responsible for mass incarceration and the monstrous penal state that developed in the 1980s, 1990s in this country, um, because of the violence and the social problems that emerged in abandoned communities and in stressed lower class families where there was no work for generations and no social support from a welfare state.
And with this fentanyl epidemic that is happening in the US, is the harm reduction a sort of effective solution, or it is not?
So the spread of deaths of despair, as they were famously described, amongst white middle-aged people as well as young people and people of color. That's a major expression, a major symptom, I think, of precisely the malaise of the American economy, and the malaise particularly of working people of all colors in all regions, in urban and rural areas, in small towns and large cities, and the the spread of a kind of a painkiller drug, sometimes on the drug market, sometimes through medical prescriptions, is, I think, just a tragic symptom of that feature. How one deals with that. So, dealing with drug abuse, dealing with drug deaths, dealing with overdoses and so on. There are immediate short-term interventions and ways of dealing with it, and long-term structural changes. The immediate short-term issues and the structural changes are different on different timelines, involving different social actors, different politics, different prospects. There's lots that can be done with crime and with drug use and drug abuse and with drug deaths, that doesn't wait for structural change at the level of building social democracy. The will to produce and the will to intervene with short-term, immediate local solutions is quite different from the will to build a welfare state or a social democracy. Nevertheless, the two things interact at some level, because the people who see the right response to you know drugs as being to lock up drug dealers and drug users are not the same people who are thinking it would be a good idea to extend um, controls on capitalism and build a welfare state.
We see, yeah, we see that connection that is not casual at all. And I have to say that finishing this interview for me, like, I mean, I didn't feel like an interview at all. It was like a really joyful talk, I have to say. And let's go to three joyful questions that every guest has, that you have to recommend a movie, you have to recommend a book in whatever genre, and for the Spotify listeners, you have to recommend a song that you like.
So I should have been able to know about this in advance and think about this in advance. So I don't know. The most recent movie I saw and enjoyed was Return to Seoul. I think everyone should go and see that. It's a very enjoyable French movie about a woman returning to South Korea, finding her roots. The most recent book I enjoyed and think everyone should read, I don't know. Um, I'm actually reading Middlemarch by George Eliot. Everyone should go off and read that. Um, as for what should people be listening to on Spotify, I entirely recommend the new album by the Scottish group Bell and Sebastian, Late Developers, it's called. And perhaps you should read. Perhaps you should listen to Juliet Naked, which is the first track on that album.
Excellent recommendation by David Garland. Well, what can I say? This is and I have to say this because it's like a duty for me that David Garland, that is a well-renowned scholar, is talking with a youth, with a young scholar like me from Argentina, that is not in the first world, let's say, and he's doing because he wants. And this is a message for all the scholars, and all the scholars actually in Argentina that are kind of in a diva play role, that don't want to talk or to even discuss a topic. So thank you very much, David, for this. Really,
So
thank you.
let me have a final word. I've had two trips to Argentina, courtesy of Maximo Sosso, who might be the world's most uh, uh, networked Argentinian criminologist. And I spent a lot of time in Santa Fe talking to Argentinian students and also students from all across South America coming to the kind of criminology course that Maximo runs there. And I have to say, it's one of the warmest, friendliest encounters I've had ever. So I'm only too pleased to speak to an Argentinian interviewer and to an Argentinian audience.
Thank you very much, David. Soy Facundo Guadagno, nos vemos en otro episodio de Diálogos.